Part 3. The Pact. The silence that followed the static from Maya's livestream was the most profound Liam had ever experienced. It was a vacuum, a void where a young life had just been. He sat frozen in the armchair, the spectral green lines on his laptop the only light in the room, the ghost of a girl's final scream echoing in his ears. He had been a passive observer, a collector of sounds, but now he felt like an accessory. He had listened to a murder and done nothing. Dawn did not break the spell this time. The morning light that filtered into Havenwood felt ashamed weak. When Liam finally forced himself to open the front door, the town was already in motion, but it was the convulsive, horrified movement of a disturbed anthill. Cars were pulling out of driveways. People were standing on their porches, talking in low, urgent tones. The pretense of normalcy had been ripped away, exposing the raw terror that lay beneath. Sheriff Brody's cruiser was parked in front of the Chen's house down the street. A small crowd of neighbors stood at a respectful distance, their faces pale and grim. Brody himself stood on the lawn, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a century of ghosts. Liam found Ethan in his driveway, throwing a heavy-duty flashlight and a coil of rope into the bed of his truck. Ethan's face was a mask of grim resolve. "Brody's getting a search party together," Ethan said, not waiting for Liam to ask. "Daylight only. We're meeting at the station. You coming?" "What's the point?" Liam asked, his voice raw. "We know what happened." "The point," Ethan said, slamming the tailgate shut with a loud clang, "is her parents. The point is pretending we have a shred of control over this goddamn place. The point is finding her phone." He looked at Liam, his eyes hard. "And the point is you and I both know that thing is out there, and we're the only two people who might be able to figure out how to do something about it. Your recordings, your gear. That's more than anyone's had to fight with ever. But we need to know for sure. We need proof." The search party was a somber affair. 20 men, mostly middle-aged, all with the haunted eyes of Havenwood natives. They carried rifles and shotguns, useless talismans against a foe that couldn't be shot. Sheriff Brody gave the instructions, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. They were to comb the woods around the quarry, working in pairs, never losing sight of each other. They had until 4 p.m. Then everyone, no matter what they had or hadn't found, was to get out of the woods. Liam was paired with Ethan. They moved through the dense undergrowth, the forest floor a damp carpet of decaying leaves. The woods were different in the daylight, but no less menacing. The trees were too close together, their branches like twisted, arthritic fingers, blotting out the sun. A constant, oppressive silence seemed to absorb the sound of their footsteps. Liam found himself listening intently, analyzing every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. He was starting to think like his equipment, filtering the world through an auditory lens. It was Liam who found it. Tucked beneath a fern near the quarry's edge, half buried in the mud, was Maya's phone. The screen was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the center, but the device itself was intact. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. It felt heavy, like a sacred, cursed object. "Ethan," he called out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Ethan came crashing through the brush." He looked at the phone in Liam's hand and let out a long, shuddering breath. "God help her," he murmured. They took the phone straight to the library. Evelyn Reed was waiting, as if she knew they would come. She didn't say a word, just led them to a back office and closed the door. The three of them huddled around the small desk as Liam carefully plugged the phone into his laptop, praying the internal memory wasn't corrupted. It wasn't. The final video file was there. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the mouse. "Play it," Brody's voice said from behind them. They turned to see the sheriff standing in the doorway, his face gray with exhaustion. He must have heard on his radio that the phone had been found. He closed the door behind him, sealing the four of them in the small book-lined room. Liam clicked play. They watched the last few minutes of Maya's life again, but this time they weren't just watching a screen, they were bearing witness.
the bravado, the growing fear, the sudden, piercing shriek.
When the screen went black, Liam didn't stop the file. He let the audio play.
For 30 seconds, there was only the sound of the phone scraping against the gravel and the chirping of cricket.
Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, wet, tearing noise, accompanied by a low guttural humming. It was the sound of something feeding, of something processing. And then, woven into it, came the whispers. It was Maya's voice, but it was fractured, broken into phonemes, the building blocks of speech. My nanonoma s. The entity was learning her. It was deconstructing her voice, her identity, and adding it to its collection. The final sound on the recording was the entity practicing its new acquisition. A perfect, clear, cheerful replica of Maya Chen's voice saying, "Hey everyone." Ethan retched into a trash can. Brody leaned against the wall, his eyes closed, his face a stony mask of grief and fury. Evelyn simply stared at the computer, her expression one of ancient sorrow. "The pact is failing," she said, her voice barely a whisper. For generations, it was content to take only those who broke the rule. It was a toll.
Attack sped in blood.
But now, it is growing bolder. It is hungry. The old wards carved into the town's foundations are fading. It is beginning to dissolve its cage. What pact? Brody demanded, his voice rough.
I've heard the stories, Evelyn. The town charter, the warning.
I always thought it was folklore to explain the unexplainable. The folklore is a faded memory of the truth, David, Evelyn said, using his first name. Our ancestors didn't just happen upon a monster. They summoned it. They bound it. They made a bargain for prosperity, and in return, they fed it the darkness. They created a sanctuary of daylight for themselves by feeding the night to a god of hunger and sound. She looked directly at Liam. What you are hearing is the sound of that god digesting a soul. The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them. So what do we do? Liam asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and rage. We just keep locking our doors? We wait for it to pick us off one by one when the locks don't work anymore. No, Evelyn said. She stood and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the office. She retrieved a long, tin scroll case, rusted with age. We cannot break the pact. To do so would unleash the entity entirely. It is bound to this valley, and we are bound with it. But we can interfere with it. We can blind it. She unrolled the scroll on the desk. It was a hand-drawn map of the valley, intricate and ancient. In the center, deep within the forest, was a symbol, a complex spiral of interlocking lines. This is the Whistler's altar, she explained, her finger tapping the symbol. It is a monolithic lodestone, a natural magnetic anomaly. It is the heart of its power, the focus of its presence. The original pact was sealed there, and its power still resonates from that stone.
You want us to go there?
Ethan asked, his voice incredulous. At night. It is the only way, Evelyn said. The entity is a creature of vibration, of resonance. It exists as sound and feeds on it. But like any resonance, it can be disrupted. A counterfrequency, a harmonic dissonance introduced at the source of its power, could effectively blind it. It would not kill it, but it would sever its connection to the town, deafen it to us. It would be trapped in the woods, a silent king in a silent kingdom. She turned to Liam. The founders used bells and incantations, primitive sympathetic magic. But you have a new kind of magic.
You understand frequency.
You can create the exact resonance needed. Liam stared at the map, his mind racing. His equipment, his knowledge. It wasn't a coincidence he was here. He was the one person in generations who possessed the specific skill set to fight this thing on its own terms. It was a terrifying, electrifying thought. What would it take? He asked. It would take a powerful, sustained sonic pulse broadcast at the altar, Evelyn said. and it would take a sacrifice. Brody stiffened.
What kind of sacrifice?
The ritual to blind it requires a tremendous amount of energy. Not sound, but life force. An emotional catalyst, she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. At the moment the pulse is triggered, one person must stand at the altar and give themselves to it. They must draw its full attention, its full hunger. Their fear, their life, their very identity will be the fuel that powers the ritual, a final terrible offering to overwhelm it as the counter-frequency severs the connection. The four of them looked at each other, the horrifying reality of the plan settling over them. It wasn't a fight. It was a trade.
One life to save the town.
The new moon is in 2 nights, Evelyn said. Its power will be at its nadir. It is our only chance.
Silence descendait upon the small office.
The decision hung in the air, unspoken but absolute. They were done hiding. I'll get my gear ready, Liam said, his voice steady. He would build the device. He would create the sound. I'll gather supplies, Ethan added, his fear being pushed down by a fierce protective loyalty. Weapons, climbing gear, whatever we need to get to that altar. Sheriff Brody walked over to the map and stared at it for a long moment. He touched the symbol of the altar with a calloused finger. When he turned back to them, his eyes were clear, his weariness replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I'll clear the way, he said. And in his voice, Liam heard the final terrible piece of the plan fall into place. He understood who the sacrifice would be. Brody was the town's shepherd, and he intended to give his life to save his flock from the wolf at the door.
Par 4, the darkness.
The next 2 days passed in a blur of tense, focused activity. Liam didn't leave his mother's house. He worked with a feverish intensity, cannibalizing parts from his high-end audio equipment, soldering wires, and writing code. He was building what he'd grimly nicknamed the Orpheus device, a portable battery-powered emitter capable of generating a complex, multi-layered sonic frequency. Based on the ultrasonic signature he'd recorded, and on ancient harmonic principles Evelyn had found in her books, the theory was sound. The device would emit a white noise of pure dissonance, precisely calibrated to overwhelm the entity's sensory spectrum. It was the most important sound design of his life. Ethan became their quartermaster, gathering supplies with quiet efficiency. He brought military-grade flashlights with focused beams, climbing ropes, medical kits, and extra batteries for Liam's device. He also brought 2 shotguns and a powerful hunting rifle, laying them on the kitchen table. I know, he said, seeing Liam's expression. But it'll make me feel better.
Sheriff Brody cam Bayon Lyons.
He didn't talk about the plan or the altar. He brought a box of his late wife's photo albums and asked Liam to store them for his daughter, who lived in California. It was his version of a last will and testament. His calm was the most unsettling thing Liam had ever witnessed. It was the absolute peace of a man who had already accepted his own death. On the evening of the new moon, the sky was a starless, ink-black canvas. The air was unnaturally still.
The trimen gatred in Eleanor Caldwell's kitchen, the Orpheus device sitting on the table between them like a strange, metallic cat.
It was a compact box, covered in dials and a small screen displaying a fluctuating sine wave. Ready? Brody asked, his voice even. Liam nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Ethan gave a short, jerky nod, his hand gripping the stock of a shotgun. Evelyn had given them each a small iron charm, cold to the touch, inscribed with a symbol from the map. It will not make you invisible, she had warned. But it may confuse its senses. Avert its gaze, if only for a moment. Liam clutched his in his pocket, the sharp edges digging into his palm. They left through the back door and melted into the darkness. The familiar backyard was now an alien landscape. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen life. They moved in silence, following a trail Brody knew by heart, one that led deep into the forbidden woods. The beams of their flashlights cut sharp, nervous tunnels through the suffocating dark.
The woods at night were a different world.
The silence was absolute, a living entity. There were no crickets, no owls, no sounds of nightlife. Everything was hiding, or everything was already dead. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the crunch of their boots on the forest floor. They had been walking for nearly an hour when they heard it.
The Whistler.
It was a soft, three-note tune, seemingly coming from all directions at once. It was a sound of casual, confident menace. It knew they were here.
The un tas de beguin.
Don't listen, Brody grunted, his shotgun held at the ready.
Keep moving. Focus on the trail.
But the whistling was just the overture.
The voices came next.
They started as faint whispers at the edge of hearing, fragments of the damned. Liam recognized the terrified voice of the miner from his recordings, the desperate cries of children long since taken.
The air grew cold, and the whisper swirled around them, a ghostly chorus of Avenue des Lost Souls.
Then, it got personal.
Ethan, a voice whispered, sweet and familiar.
Ethan froze, his flashlight beam wavering. It was the voice of his grandmother, who had died a decade ago.
I'm lost, One.
Can you help me find my way? It's not real, Liam said, grabbing his friend's arm.
Ethan, look at me.
It's not real. Ethan shook his head, his eyes wide with horror. It sounds just like her. The entity was toying with them, probing their minds, searching for their deepest fears and regrets. It found Liam's easily. Liam, baby, why didn't you call? I waited for you to call. His mother's voice, thick with sorrow and accusation. It cut him deeper than any knife. He stumbled, the Orpheus device feeling impossibly heavy in his pack. He saw her face in the darkness, her sad, disappointed eyes. It's in your head, son, Brody said, his voice a firm anchor in the swirling chaos.
It's pulling on your memory.
Starve it.
Don't give it anything.
They pressed on, a three-man island in an ocean of psychological warfare. The entity grew more frustrated, its attacks becoming more direct. It began mimicking their own voices, trying to separate them. Help me. Over here. Liam heard Ethan yell from his left. But the real Ethan was still right beside him.
It's got me.
My leg is broken. He heard a perfect copy of his own voice cry out from the darkness behind them. They clung together, trusting their eyes over their ears, pushing through the thick, grasping branches.
The trail grew steeper.
They were nearing the altar.
The air grew coldestill, and the whisper intensified, a deafening roar of stolen voices all screaming at us.
And then they saw it. In a clearing ahead, a pillar of black rock rose toward the sky, a jagged tooth of granite that seemed to drink the very darkness around it. It was the Whistler's altar. The rock hummed with a low, vibrating energy that Liam could feel in his teeth. At the base of the altar, the air shimmered, like heat haze on a summer road. The distortion coalesced, pulling the darkness into itself, and for the first time, Liam saw a shape. It was vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too thin, its limbs jointed at impossible angles. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface that seemed to ripple and shift. This was the source. This was the god of the valley. Liam. The device. Now. Brody yelled. Liam scrambled to pull the device from his pack. His hands were numb, his fingers clumsy. He fumbled with the dials, setting the frequency. The entity on the other side of the clearing turned its featureless face toward them. A new voice filled the clearing, but this one wasn't a memory. It was the clear, terrified voice of Maya Chun. It hurts, the voice cried, seeming to come from the creature itself. Please, make it stop. It was a calculated, final cruelty. Ethan, cover him. Brody ordered. He took a deep breath and began to walk forward, toward the altar, toward the shimmering creature. Hey, he bellowed, his voice ringing with a lifetime of defiance.
You want a soul? Come and take a real one. Come on, you bastard.
The creature turned its full attention to Brody.
The shimmering around it intensified.
It recognized the challenge, the offering. It began to glide toward him, silent and inexorable.
Now, Liam.
Brody roared, his back to them.
Liam flicked the final switch.
A deafening, complex shriek erupted from the Orpheus device. It was a sound of pure weaponized chaos, 1,000 nails on 1,000 chalkboards, a symphony of discordance. Liam clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound bored directly into his skull. The entity recoiled as if struck a physical blow. The shimmering around it flickered violently. The chorus of stolen voices cried out in pain, 100 echoes dying at once. It was working. Brody stood his ground, just feet from the creature. He was the bait. He was the anchor. The creature, wounded by the sound, focused its rage on him. It lunged. Brody didn't scream. Liam saw his flashlight fall and extinguish. He saw the shimmering darkness envelop the sheriff, saw Brody's form distort and then dissolve. He was gone. The life force, the emotional energy of his sacrifice, hit the clearing like a shockwave. At that exact moment, the sound from Liam's device peaked. The sine wave on the screen turned a solid, screaming red. The air itself seemed to tear apart. The creature threw back its faceless head and let out a silent, agonizing scream that Liam felt in his bones. The shimmering form began to unravel, to fray at the edges like burning film. It wasn't dying, but it was being disconnected. Unplugged from the world it had fed on for so long. With a final violent implosion of darkness and cold, it vanished. The sound from the device died, its battery spent. And for the first time in 200 years, the woods of Havenwood were truly silent. The crickets began to chirp. Liam and Ethan stood there for a long time, shaking, their ears ringing, staring at the spot where their friend had ceased to exist. The first, pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the tops of the trees. They had survived. They had won. The walk back to town was a long, solemn procession. They didn't speak. There were no words for what they had seen, for what they had done, for what had been lost. When they emerged from the tree-line into the back of Liam's yard, the sun was rising, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The town was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was peaceful. As the sun climbed higher, doors began to open. People emerged onto their porches, not with fear, but with a tentative, bewildered hope. They looked toward the woods, their lifelong enemy, and for the first time, they felt nothing coming back. The presence was gone. Liam knew life in Havenwood would never be the same. It was a town scarred, a town built on a terrible secret that was now finally over. They would mourn Sheriff Brody as a hero, though only a few would ever know the true nature of his sacrifice. Ethan clapped a heavy hand on Liam's shoulder. "He saved us, Lee. He saved all of us." Liam nodded, looking at his mother's house. He had come back to close a chapter of his life, to bury a parent. Instead, he had confronted the ghosts of an entire town, and in doing so, had finally quieted the ones inside himself. The guilt over his mother, the aimlessness of his life, it had all been burned away in the darkness of the woods. He wouldn't be returning to Chicago. His work was here, in the silence. He was an audio archivist, and this town, this wounded, healing town, had a new history that needed to be recorded. A history that began not with a scream, but with the welcome, ordinary, beautiful sound of a brand new day. 3 months later, the season had turned. The oppressive humidity of August had given way to the crisp, clean chill of late November. The trees that ringed the valley, once a uniform wall of menacing green, were now a fiery tapestry of crimson and gold. The darkness still came early, as it always did in autumn, but it was no longer a threat. It was just the night. Liam stood on the porch of his mother's house, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, and watched the sun set. It was a beautiful, ordinary spectacle, and it filled him with a quiet sense of peace that he was still getting used to. He no longer flinched at the lengthening shadows. He no longer listened for whispers in the wind. The silence of Havenwood had been broken. In its place was a symphony of normalcy that Liam now documented with the same passion he had once reserved for obscure soundscapes. The cheerful shouts of kids playing street hockey under the newly installed streetlights. The distant rumble of the late-night freight train, a sound the town had never heard before because they'd all been hiding behind locked doors. The murmur of conversation and laughter spilling from the rusty mug, the town's only bar, which now stayed open past midnight. He had stayed. The thought of returning to the sterile quiet of his Chicago studio had become impossible. His life was here now, intertwined with the fate of this small, scarred town. He had established the Havenwood Sound Archive, a project funded by a small grant from the State Historical Society. His official mission was to document the oral histories of the town's oldest residents. His private mission, the one only he, Ethan, and Evelyn knew about, was to preserve the story of what they had done. He was the keeper of the truth. A pickup truck, its engine a familiar, healthy rattle, pulled into his driveway. Ethan hopped out, carrying a small box. His movements were lighter now, the perpetual fear gone from his eyes. The shared trauma of that night in the woods had forged their childhood friendship into an unbreakable bond. "Thought you might be cold," Ethan said, handing him the box. Inside was a thermos of what smelled like mulled cider. "Figured you'd be out here, watching the dark roll in." "Old habits," Liam smiled. "Thanks, man." "You going to the dedication?" Ethan asked, leaning against the porch railing next to him. Liam nodded.
"Wouldn't miss it."
The town had voted to turn the abandoned quarry into a memorial park. They had cleared the gravel, planted grass, and installed a simple granite plaque. It didn't tell the whole story, of course. It was dedicated to the memory of Maya Chun and Sheriff David Brody, victims of a tragic accident. But the town knew. They knew Brody had somehow saved them. He was a hero, a legend whispered about in tones of awe and reverence. Later, as the town gathered under temporary floodlights at the new park, Liam stood at the back of the crowd with Evelyn Reed. She was leaning on a cane now, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "They are resilient," she said, watching the families and children move about without fear.
"Dave taken back the night."
"It's more than I ever thought I'd live to see." "It's because of him," Liam said quietly. "It's because of all of you," she corrected him gently. "You brought a new kind of knowledge to an old kind of fight."
"You changed the story, Liam."
He thought about that later, back in his makeshift studio in the living room.
Changing the story.
He had all the audio from that final night archived on a secure encrypted hard drive. He had listened to it only once, to catalog it. The shriek of the Orpheus device, the cacophony of the entity's dissolution, the terrible final silence where Brody's life had been. He hadn't intended to ever listen to it again. But something had been bothering him, a loose thread in the back of his mind. A signal he'd seen on the spectral display in the chaotic moments of the climax, one he had dismissed at the time as feedback or an anomaly. Driven by a familiar, obsessive curiosity, he pulled up the file. He isolated the exact moment Brody had been taken, the moment the device had peaked. He filtered out the overwhelming noise of his own creation, peeling back the layers of sound, cleaning the signal with painstaking precision. And then he heard it.
"It was underneath everything else. A ghost in the machine."
It wasn't the whistler. It wasn't the stolen voices. It was something else entirely. It was a sound that had no terrestrial analog. It was a deep, resonant, impossibly ancient thrum, like the slow breathing of a sleeping mountain. And woven within it was a complex, clicking pattern, like the language of insects and collapsing stars. It hadn't been a sound of aggression or pain. In the face of their desperate, violent struggle, this other sound had been one of calm, detached observation. It was the sound of something else in the woods, something far older and far larger than the whistler, that had simply been listening. The whistler, for all its terror, had just been the thing making the most noise. A profound, bone-deep chill spread through Liam's body. They hadn't cleared the woods. They had just silenced a barking dog, unaware of the silent, watching dragons that lay coiled in the shadows behind it. The pact the founders had made. Maybe it wasn't just to buy prosperity. Maybe it was to keep this other, quieter thing asleep. He saved the isolated audio file, labeling it simply, Unknown. He looked out the window at the deep, impenetrable blackness of the forest that ringed his home. The fear was gone, yes. He was no longer afraid of what might be hunting in the dark. But a new feeling had taken its place. A sense of profound, humbling, and terrifying awe. He had become the guardian of Havenwood's history, the archivist of its silence. And he understood now that his work had only just begun. The night was safe, but the world was no less mysterious, and he was the only one listening to its deepest, darkest secrets. Our story, The Sundown Pact, comes to an end here. Thank you for listening.
What do you think of this haunting open ending?
Will Liam and the town of Havenwood have to face an entity even more terrifying than the Whistler? Let Horror Stories know your thoughts by leaving a comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to catch the next story. Goodbye, and we'll see you again for the next sleepless night.